You're listening to Meet the Thriller Author, the podcast that features interviews with thriller, mystery, and suspense authors. I am your host, Alan Peterson, and today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/MTTA. And that's an M as in murderer. Over 180,000 titles, including great thrillers to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So stay tuned for the next episode of Meet the Thriller Author. Hey everybody, this is Alan Peterson with Meet the Thriller Author. And for this episode, I have Timothy Hallinan on Skype. He's an award-winning author of 20 highly praised novels. He currently is writing 2 series, the Poke Rafferty Bangkok Thrillers, which is focused on Thailand-based American travel writer and his cross-cultural family. And the 4th volume, the Queen of Patpong, was nominated for an Edgar Award. And the Junior Bender Mysteries, about a Los Angeles burglar who moonlights, usually reluctantly, as a private eye for crooks. So I'm really excited to talk to Timothy today. Timothy, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Can you hear that airplane?
Let's see. No, I can't. Okay,
great. We're on the approach to Santa Monica Airport, and I can always close the house up.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't hear anything. So how are you doing? Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Totally my pleasure.
Can you tell our listeners about yourself, please?
Sure. I live in Los Angeles and in Bangkok. I write about Los Angeles and Bangkok. I've been writing full-time since 1995. Since 1990. And I consider myself the luckiest man in the world to be able to do that and still be able to pay the bills. And basically, my life boils down to my marriage, reading books and writing books, and travel. And that's sort of it. I'm not the most interesting person in the world because I sort of save all that up for the books.
Yeah, that's a dream life right there.
No kidding. No kidding.
Yeah. And so how would you describe your books to someone who hasn't read them before?
Well, I write mysteries and I write thrillers, and the difference between a mystery and a thriller is the question that's asked at the beginning. A mystery, it's whodunit, and in a thriller, it's how do you get out of it alive. I probably marginally like thrillers better. The Poke Rafferty books are thrillers. We always know who the crook is, although we have no idea how anyone's going to survive it. Except, of course, that it's a series, so that you know that most of the people you care about are going to survive, and that's just one of the conventions that we all put up with. And we still get suspenseful when the lead character's life is in danger. And the Junior Bender books, and also my earlier series about a private eye named Simeon Grist, those are traditional mysteries. We have absolutely no idea who did what to whom, at least if I did my job well, you don't know. And the main action of the book is proceeding toward the solution, and the reinstitution of order, which is always the primary mechanism of thrillers, of crime novels in general.
And your approach to writing those two different between a mystery and a thriller, is there kind of a similar way of approaching to writing these, or do you have like a different process for each, depending if it's a thriller or a mystery?
I'd love to have more than one process, but I don't. I have no idea where my stories come from. I start with a sentence. Sometimes I start with a title. Once in a while, I'll start with a central situation. In the book that's coming out in May that's self-published, which is Pulped, I went back to my private eye from the 1990s, Simeon Grist, and I asked myself, how would he react if he suddenly found out that the life he thinks he lived was actually written by someone else, and that he's a figment of the imagination. And there's a whole book structured around that. And I had so much fun writing it, I couldn't believe it. The next Bangkok book, which is called Fool's River, and it comes out in October, I told myself that what I wanted to do was to tell a minimum of 3 and probably 4 stories and have them all work out perfectly within 48 hours. And as it turned out, they worked out within 36 hours. So it's probably the fastest reading book I ever wrote. But that was what I had in mind when I started it. I mean, it's not like I start with a premise and characters and all the rest of that. I just sit down and essentially read it as I write it, and I go where the characters lead me.
Oh, that's great. And do you have like when you're writing these, do you have a set, like, I'm going to try to write, X amount of words per day, or do you just kind of, it just depends on the day, or do you try to put some sort of gauge on your writing day?
I try to write 7 days a week because it's my job and because books tend to go stale and lose their energy if you're away from them too long when you're writing them. I can't put a word number on it because there are days when I wind up writing 150 words and cutting 350, and there are days when I write 4,000 words. The important thing for me is to keep the book in the center of my mind, and the only way to do that is by writing it every single day. And when the book is in the center of your mind, what happens to you, there's a little thing in the back of your brain called the reticular activating system, and it's a sorter. What that does is it points out to you things among the millions of things we see every day, things that it knows we're interested in. That's why when you decide to buy a Honda, all of a sudden you're aware that there are all these commercials for Hondas and there are all these billboards for Hondas. That's because that system is pointing that out to you. And when you're really working on a book and you're really centered in the characters and the problems and all the rest of that, that little thing picks up everything around you that could relate to that book. And consequently, if you work on a book every day, the universe just throws you material all the time that you'd probably walk right past if you weren't actually engaged in the act of writing it.
And do you write every day, even if you're not actively working on something on a project? Do you still try to write every day?
No, if I'm in between books, I'm shamelessly lazy. I'll do nothing at all. Except that in the back of my head, there's this little panic engine that says, what are you going to write next? What are you going to write next? You don't have any ideas. Guess what? That was your last book. That's always an operation. Every book I've ever written, when I finish, I think this may be the last one. And every time it isn't. Thank God.
Yeah, that's great because you've been, like you said, you've been writing professionally since the '90s, and you still feel that way. That's fascinating for you. I only have 2 books out, but even after all those books you have, you still get that little panic feeling.
It's pretty much endless. My writing is a product of anxiety. I'm always anxious about writing, and I'm always anxious about the fact that I'm not writing, and I wait until I'm more anxious about not writing than I am about writing, and then I write. This all sounds kind of grim, except it's all about beginning, okay? Everything is harder. This is my wisdom of life after a long time trying to muddle my way through the world. Everything is harder before you start it. And once you start it, it develops its own energy, and it pulls you along. And you would think I would know that, but nevertheless, there's always an anxiety. This is the day I'll sit there and nothing will come out. This is the day when I won't be able to move the characters ahead. This is the day when I realize that I don't actually have a story. There are so many variations on writer anxiety. You probably have experienced all of them.
Yes. And then I saw an interview with David Foster Wallace with Charlie Rose, and he said that he asked him what his writing day was like, and he's like, I write 1 hour, and then I fret the other 7 hours about not writing. I'm like, yes.
Exactly right. However much you write, it isn't enough.
Yeah. Yeah, and then did you start writing thrillers? Were you a fan of thrillers and mysteries as a reader before you started to write these?
The first book I read that really took me away from my world. I was 11 years old, and it was The Long Goodbye, Raymond Chandler. And it completely superseded everything that was real in my life. I was more interested in that book than I was in school, in my parents, in my brothers, in my girlfriend, anything. And of course, the great sin that Chandler committed was that he makes it look easy. You have no idea when you're reading that how hard he worked. Do you know that he cut his writing paper in half, and he put it in the typewriter, and he put it in sideways, so he had a little tiny page, and his rule was there had to be something that qualified as magic on every single one of those half pages. It could have been a word, a description, an event, but talk about setting a standard for yourself. And when you're reading it, it feels like he just sat down and told you a story. Mm-hmm. But he worked so hard. And it shows. He's the greatest there ever was, I think.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, like basically invented a lot of the stuff that we're all doing now.
Absolutely right.
And when do you decide? When do you start writing yourself?
Whenever I get too anxious to do anything else. Most of the time, it's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I tend to write in cafes because that's where the coffee is. And I have the world's best earbuds, absolutely sensational earbuds, and I've got probably 3,000 songs and probably 100 playlists on my iPhone, and I just dial up something that I think is the right energy, and I tell them to keep the coffee coming, and I work until I run out of words.
And what inspired you to write your first book? Like, when did you sit down and say, I'm going to try to write a book?
I had a really good job. I was running a company that was in show business. I was living in Los Angeles, New York, London, and Bangkok, and I had everything in the world that I had any right to expect ever to have. But I wasn't. There was always this thing in the back of my mind that I was going to be a writer. And I sat down and I wrote a perfectly awful book with a great title, The Wrong End of the Rainbow. I've used that title a dozen times since, never as the title of a book, but I use it in books as the title of a book that people read. And it was terrible, but I discovered that it was possible to tell a story without knowing where you were going. And in fact, at that time, I also started reading Raymond Chandler on writing, and Chandler said the best way to keep the reader from knowing who done it is not to know it yourself. You know, which is like it's a license. Go do work by the seat of your pants. So that was a book, a private eye book. I wrote a second one. I never showed that to anyone, not even my wife. I wrote a second one, and it sold for a 6-book deal with HarperCollins. And that was the beginning, and I wrote those from 1990 to 1996, and then I quit completely everything else in the world, and did nothing but make money for about 4 years, so I'd never have to work again. And since then, this is literally all I've done.
You set it out for publishing, and you were picked up right away. Huh? Like your first try, or
the first one I put into a box, and it's still in that same box.
Okay. No one's seen that one. Okay.
No one's. That was dreadful, but was a great title. And the second one, which was called Skin Deep, sold. And what's more, it sold for a 3-book deal with an option for another 3-book deal, which they exercised when I turned in the second book. So it was a 6-book deal.
Wow. And are you still published with them, or no, you're with Penguin now, right? Or
no, yeah, I'm with Random House essentially. Soho, which is an all-crime imprint that works with Random House. No, they let me go because the books didn't sell. They got great reviews. I mean, really great reviews. They were nominated for awards, but the books didn't sell. So they let me go, and I sort of seethed for a while, and then I decided I'm not going to do anything except make enough money so that I don't have to do anything but write. Mm-hmm. And that occupied me for a few years, and now it's just absolutely that. I'm trying to write 3 books a year, 2 for regular publication and 1 for self-publication.
What's the difference that you're seeing between those 2 worlds? I know the publishing world has just changed so much the last 5-6 years.
There are huge advantages to both. The advantage to self-publication. Let's start with traditional publication. Traditional publishers give you a whole team. You've got an absolutely wonderful editor who looks at this with a new eye. You've got a terrific copy editor. My copy editor is Thomas Pynchon's copy editor. I specify her by contract, and she brings so much to the table I can't tell you. You've got people running around coming up with cover designs, flap copy. There are all these people taking this idea that I sort of spewed out in some coffee house and turning it into an actual book, and that's an amazing feeling. You know, and then there's the release and the box of books lands, and that's still, there's almost nothing to beat it. The problem is that it comes with certain restrictions. They would prefer you not write for other publishers, for example. Almost all contracts come with some sort of, at the very least, a first refusal. They get to look at it first, and only if they say no can you take it anywhere else. Self-publishing has no restrictions whatsoever. You put it up on your own, it flies or it doesn't fly. You do what you can to promote it. If it works, you get a paycheck every single month. Bang, right off the top. There's 3 months there where they let the money accumulate, and from then on, every fifth of the month, you get a wad of money from Amazon or from Barnes & Noble or from whomever you published it with. That has a lot to recommend it, because in traditional publishing, generally you get paid twice a year. And I like knowing that money is coming in on the 5th of every month. I also like being in charge of my covers. The pulped cover is sensational. Not that they don't do great covers. They do. My publishers have always given me good covers except for the first one, which I'll never forget. But, it's like traditional publishing, you have this enormous support team. Self-publishing is like being the guy who walked on the rope between the Twin Towers. Yeah. There's nobody there, okay? You are doing it all, and that's got kind of a thrilling aspect to it as well. So I really like both of them. I would really hate to lose my traditional publishers, because the people at the company are some of my best friends. But at the same time, it's nice to be able to think, I can write anything I want. Pulped is so far outside my normal range of storytelling that I'm not sure they would have even taken it if I had shown it to them. But if I'm self-publishing, that's my mistake to do. I can fall on my ass in front of everybody, and there's no one to protect me, and that's actually kind of a free feeling.
And when is that book coming out, Pulp?
Pulp will come out probably, we're shooting it May 1st. It will be both ebook and a perfectly beautiful trade paperback. It's a book I really care. I care about all of them, but this is something I've never tried to do before. It's half one genre and half another genre. It's a detective story, but it's also a book about books. The cover of the book is the picture of the cover of a book, and there's a reason for that. And I had a great time writing it, and I didn't have to worry about whether anybody would want it or not, because I was always going to do it myself.
And so you said that the character in Pulp is one that you had written in the 90s. So
yes, Simeon Grist. His name is Simeon Grist. He was a guy like me who stayed in college forever, getting one useless degree after another, because he knew how they graded you in college, and he wasn't sure how they did it in the rest of the world. And I did that. I was in college for decades, it seems to me. And when he finally got kicked out of college, he had to figure out what to do, and he fell into being a private eye. And I liked writing him enormously. He was more like me than any character I've ever written. But, the question is, what happens to a guy like Simeon, who believes that all these stories that he was in actually happened to him, and that he lived through them by his wits and all the rest of that, and his courage and so forth? What happens when he discovers that he's actually the product of somebody else's imagination? It's and what the idea is, that there is a place, a kind of a limbo, that's in something called the Imagisphere, which is, if you're the character in an unsuccessful series of thrillers, of crime novels, when the last unsold copy of the final book in the series is pulped to make newsprint and toilet paper, there's a kind of, and you find yourself up in this sort of no person's land that's all unemployed detectives, and you have this shattering realization that you haven't been real. You remember your books, you don't know anything except your books. Your only link to the world down here, so to speak, is that when someone down here opens your books, you're both down there on the page and up there in the Imagisphere, and you can look up through the book and see the person who's reading your book, and you know what they're reading. And that's what he's doing, and it's the only entertainment there is. It's really boring up there. That's what he's doing when a pair of hands go around his reader's throat and strangle him. And the question then becomes, how do you get down there to solve the murder of your reader? And what happens when you're down there? And that's what the book is about. And it's really funny. I mean, I'll say that with total confidence. It's the funniest book I've ever written, and I had a great time with it.
Yeah, it sounds like an amazing plot, like a very like David Lynch type of Blue Velvet kind of movie.
Yeah, it is. There's a guy in England who writes kind of mysteries in which characters from one book go into another book, and I can't think of his name right now. I read one of his books many years ago, and that was probably the seed of this. But it's different because, among other things, he falls in love down there. How do you cope with that when it's over? When your 24 hours down there are over, you're a fictional character in love with a real woman. Anyway, it was the most fun I've had writing in a long time, and it'll either do well or it won't. I may get an offer to traditionally publish it. The last 2 books I self-published were bought for publication, and I decided to go with that because it was a good offer. So I don't know. There may be an offer on this one. It's pretty weird. I don't know. It's a pretty weird book.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. So by the time we're recording this in mid-April, but by the time listeners are listening to this, hopefully it'll be out. But I'll have links to your Amazon page and everything, so they can go find it, because it sounds like a great read.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And so now. So you write in about LA and Bangkok. Is a lot of your life experiences, do they make it into your books?
I suppose that anything we imagine is a product of something we experienced, but except for the traditional putting in really unflattering portraits of people you don't like under a fictitious name, which most of us have done at one time or another, I'm not really very conscious of the fact that the idea that my real life and my books rub up against each other very much. The one enormous exception to that is in the Bangkok books. My hero, whose name is Poke Rafferty, Poke is short for Philip. It was given to him by his father because he poked his nose into things that didn't concern him. Poke and his wife, Rose, who's Thai, have adopted a street child, a little girl named Meow. Adopted her right off the pavement. And in many ways, Meow is my favorite character in the series. And I've thought for a long time that when she's 19 or 20 and she moves out and she leaves Poke and Rose alone in this apartment that's always felt too small, and all of a sudden it feels enormous, that's probably the end of the series. But when I was first in Bangkok and working on the Simeon Grist books, I was writing them in a little cafe on Patpong Road, which is was at that time the most notorious red light street in the world, probably. And I'm there from about 11 in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon, and I became aware that I was being watched. And I turned around, and here's a little girl, filthy, pushed up against the glass, staring at me. And the minute she sees me looking at her, she turns and runs. And she's got a box in front of her that's suspended from a leather strap around her neck. I later found out that thing actually cut into her neck, and she bled all day long from it. And she ran away. 3 days later, she was back. 4 days later after that, she was back. She kept running away. Finally, I called her in. I set up the only game on the computer was pinball. I set it up. I showed her how to work the plungers, and I went for a 40-minute walk. And when I came back, she was gone. The booth was empty. There were 3 boxes of gum. That's what she was selling out of that box, was chewing gum. 3 packs of gum in a perfectly neat little pile in the center of my plate, and an astronomical score on pinball. And from then on, she came back every 3 or 4 weeks. And her name was Meow, just like the little girl in my books. And about 4 years later, when she was probably turning 14 or 15, she stopped coming. And I've wondered ever since what happened to her, and I'm sure it wasn't good. Mm-hmm. So in that case, someone I met in real life actually stepped pretty much unchanged, because she was always spiky, intelligent, defensive, self-aware. She stepped directly into this series of books. She may have been the actual reason that I started writing the books, was to find a story I could put her in.
And what are the challenges when you're writing? I mean, like the research-wise, do you do like I mean, you're there in Bangkok, and like this character that's this girl inspired these books. But what other challenges do you have, and how much research do you put into your books before you start writing them?
I don't really do much of anything. Google is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
The research, and so once again, I guess I told you a lie before. My daily life does find its way into my books because it's impossible to stand on a sidewalk in Bangkok and not see a book go by every 30 minutes. I mean, there's the difference between rich and poor is so enormous. The difference between privilege and no privilege is so enormous, and yet the Thais work so hard to put a good face on it all, that it's just so dramatically rich that, in a sense, just living there is research, and that's the research I do. The Junior Bender books, he's the burglar. Junior knows everything about a lot of things. He knows how to spot the good stuff from the cheap stuff. He can find the one necklace that's worth something in a drawer full of necklaces in a tenth of a second. And he does that through a kind of expertise that he's developed since he started robbing houses at 16 years old. And all of that comes straight out of Google. God bless Google. And people write in all the time and say, wow, how did you find this out? And the answer is, I got it off Google.
And what about when you're writing your series? Do you like work on the mystery and then the thriller, or do you like bounce between both series at the same time, or how does that?
No, can't do that.
Yeah.
Can't do that. Each of them really demands full attention. I was partway through the Rafferty book that's going to come out in October. Whatever the hell it's called, Fool's River. When my editor read a note I had written a couple of months earlier about an idea for a Junior Bender Christmas book that would take place entirely in a deteriorating mall in the last 3 days before Christmas, and she called me in Bangkok, which is where I was writing, and said, can we do this for this Christmas? And what that meant was I had to put aside Fool's River and start to write Fields Where They Lay, which is the Junior Christmas book that came out in November of last year. And I felt like I felt like a tree that had been uprooted. I mean, I could almost hear the as I was pulled out of the ground because I was so far into the world of Fool's River. And that mall in Canoga Park, California, seemed to me to be in a different galaxy. I mean, it took me days and days and days to find my way into that world again, which I had left, only about 8 weeks before when I started writing Fool's River. But, when you are plugged into a story and you've given it permission, so to speak, to call out everything in the world that relates to it, and you're wide open to all of that, it's really hard. There's no convenient off switch, so that you can say, okay, pivot 180 and start writing about a shopping mall. In the end, it worked great. The book is on a whole bunch of best of 2016 lists. The person who reviewed it for Kirkus, which is one of the publishing trades, and usually the snottiest publishing trade, said that it was the best Christmas story he had read since Sherlock Holmes, The Mystery of the Blue Carbuncle from 1892.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, gee, nobody ever said anything like that before. So in the long run, it worked out. But it was like, it was like having surgery performed without an anesthetic. It was really hard to do. So when I put one world in play in my imagination, it's not like there's a door into the other one. I have to sort of knock down the one I'm writing and build the new one before I can really begin to inhabit it and make up story about it.
And how's the working process with working with the big publishers? Do you send them the final manuscript for editing, or do you send chunks during the writing process? Or?
I have a really marvelously loose relationship. you sort of have to say when they sign you for 4 books, you sort of have to say, here are the books that are coming immediately, and then here are 2 books that will follow, and I just make up titles for those books. The Heads You Lose. I mean, just whatever the hell comes to mind. But I never write those books. By the time I get to it, I've got a different idea for it. The only thing they know is that when I say they're going to get a Junior Bender book, they're going to get a Junior Bender book. When I say they're going to get a Poke Rafferty book, they get a Poke Rafferty book. They don't see anything, and they don't ask to see anything until it's finished. They invest an enormous amount of trust in me, and it's something I appreciate enormously, because that was not necessarily the case at HarperCollins. But I give it to them whole. Here it is. I've read it. I've proofed it. I've rewritten with it. Do with it what you will. And I get, an absolutely wonderful editing letter from my editor, who starts with the world of the book and goes down to the events and goes to the character, and she's looking for improbabilities, and she's looking for, weak parts and strong parts, and I take the whole thing apart and put it back together again, following her suggestions about 85% of the time. About 15% of the time I say, no, you misunderstand, and I'll sharpen it so that it's clearer. But it's the best possible relationship, essentially. They leave me alone to write the book, and then they pay full attention to it during production.
Yeah, that's so great to hear, because sometimes you hear all those, they're so strict, you can't do anything. But that's great to hear that you have a great relationship with a publisher.
And when you have a bad one, it can be really silly. I mean, the Junior Bender books occurred to me when I was under contract with HarperCollins, and my editor at HarperCollins, who was a woman I really liked, I went to her and I said, look, I've got an idea for a new book, and here's what it is. It's a comedy series about about a burglar who works as a private eye for crooks when he has no other choice. And she said to me the single dumbest sentence anyone has ever said to me. She said, Tim, I don't think the American public associates you with comic crime fiction. And I said, I don't think 99.9% of the American people know I exist. But everybody seems to like comic crime fiction, and I don't understand what you just said. And that was sort of the beginning of the end of that relationship.
Mm. Yeah, because that's a great pitch. I mean, when I read it in your bio, I was like, oh, that sounds like an excellent series.
Yeah, and it keeps getting bought for television, so we shall see.
Oh, you're getting those options and all that stuff?
Yeah, we had a wonderful, I can't name him, but one of the world's best comics. I think the funniest man in the world, in fact, optioned it for about a year and then could not make a script out of it. And there have been a couple of other things since.
Oh, that's exciting. In that process, are you involved in that, or do it's option and then they go off and do their thing?
I'm involved as little as possible. I really don't want to have anything to do. There's somebody right now turning one of the Rafferty books into a script, and I tell him, if you want me to read it, send it to me when it's finished, and give me some time, because I'm not even going to want to read it. There's something about me that just goes, I know this isn't going to work. I know it's not going to work. And because, narrative is so much. The narrative tone you lose entirely when you write film. The people who tried to write a screenplay, there's somebody who tried to write a screenplay about Fields Where They Lay. And one of the highlights of that book is that the night before Christmas, Junior stays in the mall after it closes. He hides in a defunct record store under a counter, because half the stores in the mall are closed. And then he spends the entire night alone in the mall with a ring of keys trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And he does. He puts it all together, and by the time people stream into the mall at 7 o'clock in the morning, he's solved it. Now, the problem is he's all alone during that entire process. So you can write about that. You can write about what's going through his mind. You can write about what he feels like when this particular key fits this particular lock and what that does to his entire sense of what has been happening here. But how do you dramatize it? And the whole book falls apart. The whole script falls apart when you get to that incredibly important sequence, which is 4 chapters of a guy alone in a mall, in a dark mall, where someone has been killed and where shoplifting is up 600% and nobody knows why. And it all gets solved in his head. So that's really hard to dramatize.
Yeah, especially with the visual, with television and the movies and everything. I can imagine that would be kind of tough to tackle.
Yeah, I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to have a voiceover? Then I thought, this key fits this one. I mean, none of it works. So anyway, it's a different. It took me long enough to write a book, to learn how to write a book, that I'm not crazy enough to think that I can also learn how to write a screenplay.
And when you write your books, do you use Word or something else? Or
I'm an anti-Microsoft person. I use a free program called OpenOffice.
Okay, yeah, I remember OpenOffice,
which is terrific. And then at the end, you convert it to Word and you send it off. Mm-hmm. I just, I'm not a Microsoft fan, nor am I an Apple fan. Mm-hmm. So there you are.
All right, Timothy. Well, I'm not going to take too much more of your time here. It's been really great talking to you. But before you go, is there anything you'd like to share with the listeners?
Anybody who wants to be a writer has to face up to the fact that the only way to be a writer is to write. And that means you have to write every day. And that means you have to overcome your anxieties about not having talent. And it means you have to overcome the tendency to judge what you've just written as junk. And it means you don't wait for your muse, because guess what? You're your own muse. There is no external agency that's going to come along and tell you when to write and what to write. Picasso said, inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. And on my website, which is www.timothyhallinan.com, the biggest section on the site is called Finish Your Novel. And it is all the stuff that I used as class notes for a university level symposium. Actually, it was a full semester's class on how you integrate into your life any kind of long-term creative enterprise, so that it doesn't get shouldered out by the day-to-day demands of the real world, the so-called real world, because I think what you're writing is just as real as the world that you're living in. And lots of people, including people who have sold a lot more books than I have used that to get through books primarily, although I've also had people use it for other art forms. And I just want to say that you can do it if you really want to. You really have to want to. And I would suggest that you take a look at that, especially if what you're trying to do is to write a book, because everything I know about finishing a book, and I finished 22 of them now, 20 that have been published and 2 that are in pre-pub, everything that I know about finishing a book is in that section. And it's free.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I just pulled it up on your website. I'm going to definitely dive into this, and I'll have a link to it on the website. It's at timothyhallinan.com/writers.php. It sounds fantastic.
That's it. And by the way, I'm developing that right now into a book called The End: Writing to Finish, which will also probably be self-pub, and it'll come out maybe in the next 7 or 8 months. And I've got 25 absolutely terrific writers who have told me what they do to get out of trouble, how they integrate their routine into their daily life, so that there are chapters and then there are these writers talking, and chapters and then these writers talking. It's going to be a terrific book, I think. Writers I really respect.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about this, and you have it broken down into 6 parts. It seems like it's very comprehensive. So yeah, thank you for this.
My pleasure.
Yeah. All right, Timothy. Well, thank you so much for being on the show and for sharing your knowledge, and it's been a lot of fun talking to you.
Thank you, Alan. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Meet the Thriller Author. I'd like to ask you to please review and rate this podcast over on iTunes. It really helps me get the word out. If you take a few seconds of your time to do that, it would be much appreciated. You can also visit my website at thrillingreads.com/podcast for show notes on this episode, as well as information about the podcast in general. And you can also sign up for my mailing list there. You'll be getting special offers from our guests, as well as information, behind-the-scenes information on the podcast. And please do visit my author website at alanpeterson.com. I appreciate your support. And so until next episode, I will talk to you then.